great to be here. Thank you for hosting me in your beautiful, beautiful city. I'm from New York, if you couldn't tell from the subway video, which I thought was great. This is my first time to Bilbao, and just kind of shocked and blown away at how lovely a place it is. So thank you for having me. So today, I'm going to talk about serving gig workers, on-demand workers, freelance workers. But beyond that, really what I'm going to talk about is the unbundling of everything and the future of platforms. So we're going to cover a fair bit of ground. So I'm from Union Square Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in New York City. We've been operating for about 10 years and have invested in about 80 web and mobile companies over that period of time. Our office is in New York, but our investments are all over the world. About a quarter of our portfolio is in California, a quarter in New York, a quarter in the Midwest of America and Canada, and a quarter in Europe. And I think 5 of our last 6 investments have been European companies. So we've been spending a lot of time over here. And we invest across every sector of the economy, so media, e-commerce, health, transportation, music, you name it. And the common theme across all of our investments is that we specialize in platforms, web and mobile platforms, and we call them networks. And the idea is, software-based platforms that can enable new forms of connection, commerce, transactions. And when we think about, the topic of this conference, which is the transformation of the digital global economy, we think about it in terms of a pretty epic shift that across all sectors, across all of society, which is the shift from a hierarchical industrial model of organizing work in firms and industries and schools and so on, moving to a network-based model, where because we are connected and because we can communicate and because there's sort of information and data everywhere, you can actually fundamentally restructure every industry. So when we think about investing and we're looking at healthcare, we're looking at transportation or whatever, we try and think not about what could we do to streamline the existing processes in this sector, but instead, how can this sector be fundamentally transformed in terms of how people communicate, how it functions? What can you do here that was never possible before the internet? And if you think about the sort of all across industry and society and where this shift from an industrial model to a network model, sort of where we are in this, you've got the base of information and communication, which is pretty well established. We all have phones in our pockets, connected to the internet and email addresses and so on. And then you start to see, we've been seeing transformations happen across every vertical sector, clearly in entertainment, a fair bit in finance with things like crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. In transportation has been a really big one, but there are still many sectors of the economy where this first transition from an industrial model to a networked model hasn't fully taken hold yet. The ones that I care about a lot, that I think are really important, are health and energy and education. In education, clearly, we've made a fair bit of progress, but in health and energy, if you think about all of the importance of these fields and the sort of frictions and inefficiencies and barriers to a more networked style of communication and a networked style experience, I think we have a long way to go. So I'm going to give you one example of a sector that we've been looking at that is right now in this process of making a transition, and just to give a sense of how we look at things, how we think about it, how we sort of look at the market as it unfolds. So this conference has been about e-commerce and the user experience, and there's been tons and tons of attention paid to what it means when we can order anything we want from our phone and have it within minutes, whether that's a pizza or a ride or marijuana or whatever. And that's happening, and that's a big thing. But the less attention has been paid to the impacts that trickle down from that, sort of the backside of this new mobile on-demand commerce that we're used to, which is the impact on the firm and the impact on workers. Because once everybody is able to drive a car for one for a few minutes, because I feel like it, or, do a little bit of work over here if I'm a graphic designer, or, what have you, what it means to be a worker really changes. What it means to be a firm really changes. And the process that we talk about here is unbundling, where you take all the things that used to be packaged up together in one thing, and you split them apart. And this unbundling has been happening with the firm and with the job. So it's helpful to look at all the things that we used to think of as being part of a job. Things like a brand, where you work, what your company is. There's been a lot of talk about the impact, the relevance of brand as we switch into more of a networked economy. Getting income, finding customers, taking care of administrative, tasks and taxes and so on, dealing with benefits and insurance. In the US in particular, this has always been traditionally attached to a job. The notion of unions, you need to have a company in order to have a union to fight it. Facilities, scheduling, training, sort of sense of community, and even sense of self, identity and self-image. For a long, long time, this was all part of a job. And what's happening now is that's getting exploded. And instead, these things are all now the responsibility of the worker. So we're moving from capital J job to I'm a person and I work. And now all of a sudden, all of these things sort of defining my brand, finding customers, getting work, getting insurance, they're all on me now. And that presents a new set of challenges as the firm is not the sort of primary entity in the economy. And what we've been looking at is, on the one hand, that's very scary, to go from being protected and sort of secured by the firm to being an independent, connected, networked worker all on your own. But there's also a lot of potential to become an empowered, super independent worker. And a lot of millennials are moving towards this mode where they travel to lots of different places and work on 5 different projects at once. And there's a beautiful vision there. But to get there, there's a bunch of steps that haven't been taken yet. So I've been looking at the emerging ecosystem of new startups whose sole focus is to support the independent networked worker. The beautiful thing is that, given this big shift, you're starting to see bubbling up of many, many, many companies who understand this big trend and are there to support the worker. And we've been breaking it down into a few categories. So job discovery and scheduling, how do you find work? Benefits and insurance, a big one. Identity and reputation is increasingly important when your identity is your brand. Community and organizing, education and training, facilities, finances, and money. So sort of looking at this a basic set of categories as sort of the rebundling of what was formerly connected to the job around the worker. And what we found is there are many companies tackling this problem. Up on the screen now, you'll see maybe 30 companies that are each working in one of these categories. Almost all of these companies did not exist 9 months ago. And they are all trying to fill this role, this niche that the worker needs to sort of be empowered in the networked economy. So I want to touch on a couple of them quickly to demonstrate what it means to be operating in a network and how that's different than what we're traditionally used to. So when you look at job discovery and scheduling, all of the companies that are in the startups that are working in this space think of themselves as supply-side platforms. And this is a notion that I've heard come up a couple times today where right now in the on-demand economy, you've got the demand and the supply connected in one platform, whether that's Uber or Etsy or what have you. And this new generation of worker platforms think of themselves as a supply-side platform, like you have a supply-side platform in the ad business bargaining with the demand-side platform and advocating on its own behalf. You've got companies now who are saying, we are the advocates of the workers and we are working just for them, and we're going to be a platform just for them. Benefits is a really interesting one. I mean, particularly in the States, contribution to healthcare have been tied to full-time jobs, and there's as opposed to more attached to the worker. And if you're moving to a world where you have 10 small jobs instead of one big job, how do you get the benefits and the protections like disability and unemployment and healthcare that attach to you, not attach to any one of those jobs, because you are the unit of focus now. And a bunch of startups are trying to focus on that and how to bring those protections and attach them to the worker themselves. A really big one is identity. Right now, particularly in the on-demand space, the on-demand platform space, every platform has its own notion of identity, and any worker who works for more than one platform has identity on each platform but doesn't have their own that they can travel with. And the startups that are approaching this space are saying, we want to bring that data to the worker so the worker can travel with it and be empowered by it, and by taking your data, your reputation, and going somewhere else, you can start to exert some leverage. And finally, a question that's come up in the case of workers in a networked world is, how could you reclaim the leverage, the political leverage that you once had through the union? And and is it possible to achieve similar organizing dynamics in a dispersed, diffuse community? And my thoughts on that are that, for the last 10 years, I think we've seen distributed networked activism like never before, from the Arab Spring to, net neutrality, to, Uber riders, lobbying cities on their behalf. We're figuring out how to do politics and how to do organizing in a networked way. So there's something interesting happening there. I put together an ebook with a journalist named Elizabeth Wicke on this topic, which you can download here, which has a bunch more detail on that. So now I want to move a little bit from this trend of the hierarchies sort of moving to networks and the whole economy changing into a network model, which is happening at different rates of change, to once we have that network model in place, you start to look at the structure of the network itself and the power dynamics that are embedded in it and the architecture of it. And that is sort of like the next generation of conversations that are happening, which is how do we feel about these networks and that are reshaping the economy, and there's a whole wave of work happening there. And it's all about the nature of the platform. So if we're building platforms for everything, no two platforms are the same. They're all different. They have values baked into them. They have rules and policies and governance and infrastructure and economics baked into them. There's the phrase, data is the new oil. That's pretty right. And the primary job that platforms play in the new economy is aggregating data and using that data to make new things possible. And I think one of the biggest shifts that we're going to see is in the future are tensions around how that data is used and who controls it. So I'll talk about a couple examples of the nature of the platform. So the first one is power. Looking at the independent networked worker, right now those workers are on their own to negotiate with all the various on-demand work platforms. And this new generation of companies that's cropping up to support workers is saying, you know what, the workers in this relationship don't have enough power because they can be deactivated or the prices aren't good or whatever. And they're trying to create a layer in between that advocates for the worker, which is a worker platform. I think that's pretty interesting and sort of happening right now. And trying to create essentially a sort of a union 2.0. Another issue is values. As every sector of the economy becomes digitized and platformized, the values of the platform are really going to matter. How much do you trust that company that is mediating all aspects of your life? One company that we're investors in is Kickstarter, which is a crowdfunding platform, and they recently took a pretty big step in the way of values and communicating that to their community through incorporating as what's called a public benefit corporation, which is setting up the charter so that it has dual missions, sort of a duty to the shareholders to return value, but also a duty to your mission. And what they've done is articulated about 10 things that they will and won't do, and all relating to how they want to act towards their community and their users, and sort of laying out groundwork for so that they can stand on their values when they make business decisions, especially in the future if, for instance, they're a public company and could be exposed to shareholder lawsuits for doing things that may seem too fuzzy for sort of a hard-nosed business. Another one is privacy. There's so much data, everywhere now, and it's easy to think that the answer to everything is add more data and track more everything. And clearly, there's a lot of promise there, and a lot of our companies are working on that. But that's not the only way, and it's been interesting for us to see examples where privacy can be a differentiating feature to be competitive in the marketplace. Another one of our companies is called DuckDuckGo, which is a privacy-friendly search engine, so they don't track your search history. You go search and they don't watch. And that's their brand proposition, their value proposition. And if you look at their history over the last 5 years, it started out with a billboard, which wasn't very effective at driving adoption. And then something happens like Google changes their privacy policy and freaks people out a little bit, and people start to say, whoa, maybe I want something different. And then there were the Snowden revelations, and a bunch more people said that, and now they're integrated into Firefox and Safari. So it's been interesting to see privacy as one possible competitive vector based on platform values. And then broadly, there's this issue of trust. As more and more things are mediated on web platforms, the question arises, do we trust the people holding that data? And here's one example. So in Honduras, they recently switched from a paper-based land title system, which had been going back centuries, to a database for land title, which seems like a good idea, right? You should have all the property records in one database. It'd be much easier to access everything, et cetera, et cetera. But what they found was that somehow then folks in the bureaucracy ended up with beachfront property. And they're like, I guess we can't trust the people who are running the database to run the database. And so you have this problem of trust. And so what's happening on Honduras right now is they're rebuilding their land title database using the Bitcoin blockchain to secure the data there, with a company called Factum, which is securing all of those land records on the blockchain, which I want to talk about for a second. The blockchain has come up a few times, and it's a potentially very profound technology that's right at the heart of the extent to which we trust the technology companies that we work with. So I'm going to give a quick overview, the best I can, to explain what I mean by that and why I think it's interesting. So the blockchain is a distributed ledger, and by ledger, that is a definitive immutable record of transactions. Like in accounting, you have two sets of books, and every time money moves in the business, you sort of debit one book and credit the other book, and you can never double spend because you keep the books and you keep the books clean. The idea of the blockchain is that, but public, that anybody can use, and that every transaction is verified, and that nobody can cheat it. And because it's open source, and because it's run by thousands of computers all over the world, no one person owns it, and no one person can change the records. So once a transaction has been lodged in the blockchain, it can't be changed. So, I buy that house, you can't unbuy it from me if it's been secured in the blockchain. And there we go. And it's worth talking about the difference between Bitcoin and the blockchain, which is a little bit confusing. And the best way that I can describe that is that Bitcoin is both an app on the blockchain. It's the money app on the blockchain, so you can spend, if you're just doing transactions, there are plenty of e-commerce transactions happening in Bitcoin. But it's important to know that Bitcoin is not the whole thing. Bitcoin is just the money app on top of the blockchain, and the blockchain is really the more profound technology. And what's so interesting about the blockchain is that Bitcoin is also the incentive for maintaining the blockchain. So all of those thousands of computers around the world that are verifying all of those transactions and securing all those land records and everything else, they get paid in Bitcoins to do that. Every time they verify a certain number of transactions, it's called clearing a block, and you are awarded 25 Bitcoin. And that's the process called mining. And so this is very interesting incentive model where the Bitcoins provide the incentive to keep this network, this platform going. And in a sense, it's like stock in the Bitcoin platform. So if you think of the blockchain as a tech platform that we all use and need, just like the internet, Bitcoins are the stock in that technology. And so why is this important? So I mentioned the example of land title, but any time that there are important transactions happening where we want to make sure it can be trusted and can't be gamed or cheated by anybody, whether that's finance or land or any kind of contracts that can be embedded into the blockchain, but even silly things like likes and on a social network, or really profound things like votes. There are a lot of folks who are working on actual voting technology on the blockchain. All of these things can be stored in the blockchain, and a lot of folks out there who are working on this technology are doing it because they don't trust the people who hold the data now. And so the other way to think about it is that the blockchain is a shared data layer. So that every app can use. So if you look at today, there are 3 apps, Facebook and Uber and Airbnb. And they each build their own software, they each hold their own data, and they each, you depend on them to keep track of their own sense of time. You're trusting them that things happened when they say they happened. But in a blockchain world, you'd have those same 3 apps. They'd each hold some data. But instead of them all having their own data, they'd all be working on top of a pooled, shared set of data that is secured into the blockchain so that none of them can game the time and the fact that those things happened, and that for important sets of data, none of them will have a monopoly control over that data. And that's really, really important, where if you think about where power comes from in web platforms, to a large extent, it's control of data and accessing that data and being the only one who has control of that data. In a blockchain-based world, which we very well could be moving towards, that opportunity for web platforms may not exist anymore. And instead, platforms are going to have to compete in other ways that don't have to do with monopoly control over data. So that's a lot on the blockchain. So just to summarize, I think what's so interesting right now is that 2 things are happening at once. The first thing is that we're moving from the industrial model of everything to the networked model of everything. And that's happening, but we're not finished. And then the second thing is we're moving from version 1 of the networked model of everything to another version of the networked model of everything that's looking more critically at the structure and the power and the architecture of those networks. So it's a fascinating time to be thinking about the structure of the economy and the digital economy and all the issues of commerce and power and society that are baked into it. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you guys want to move in a little closer, I could crowd surf onto the top. I don't know if I'll do the Phil Donahue thing.
¿Alguna pregunta tenéis para Nick? Vamos a ir un poco rápido. Yes, please.
Yep. Yeah, so the question is, as we're moving from the industrial model to the network model, how do we see differences between how the US is approaching it and how Europe and maybe other countries are approaching it? Yeah? I think the biggest one that's the most obvious is control over data. If you look at Germany's data retention laws, they don't want data leaving their borders, and I think there's a sort of valid sense of being colonized by American companies, sucking all the economy, the value out, and so I think there's that dynamic. If you look in other directions, like into South America, technologies like Bitcoin and the blockchain and these radically open, radically decentralized technologies are catching fire very quickly. So that makes sense in places where there's a history of unstable currency and sort of a natural sense of distrust in centralized control platforms. And then, it's been fascinating to watch the very specific city-by-city battles that have happened over the last few years around Uber and Airbnb in particular, and how different cities are responding to that and thinking about how to transform their regulations. And I'm not sure if there's a clear European-American line there. I think maybe European cities have been a little bit more negative, but plenty of American cities have been negative to that too.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Si no, despedimos a Nick. Well, Nick, thank you very much for coming. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So I'm from Union Square Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in New York City. We've been operating for about 10 years and have invested in about 80 web and mobile companies over that period of time. Our office is in New York, but our investments are all over the world. About a quarter of our portfolio is in California, a quarter in New York, a quarter in the Midwest of America and Canada, and a quarter in Europe. And I think 5 of our last 6 investments have been European companies. So we've been spending a lot of time over here. And we invest across every sector of the economy, so media, e-commerce, health, transportation. And if you think about the sort of all across industry and society and where this shift from an industrial model to a network model, sort of where we are in this, you've got the base of information and communication, which is pretty well established. We all have phones in our pockets, connected to the internet and email addresses and so on. And then you start to see, we've been seeing transformations happen across every vertical sector. Clearly in entertainment, a fair bit in finance with things like crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. In transportation has been a really big one, but there are still many sectors of the economy where this first transition from an industrial model to a networked model hasn't, It's great to be here. Thank you for hosting me in your beautiful, beautiful city. I'm from New York, if you couldn't tell from the subway video, which I thought was great. This is my first time to Bilbao, and just kind of shocked and blown away at how lovely a place it is. So thank you for having me. So today, I'm going to talk about serving gig workers, on-demand workers, freelance workers. But beyond that, really what I'm going to talk about is the unbundling of everything and the future of platforms. So we're going to cover a fair bit of ground. Work in firms and industries and schools and so on, moving to a network-based model, where because we are connected and because we can communicate and because there's sort of information and data everywhere, you can actually fundamentally restructure every industry. So when we think about investing and we're looking at healthcare, we're looking at transportation or whatever, we try and think not about what could we do to streamline the existing processes in this sector, but instead, how can this sector be fundamentally transformed in terms of how people communicate, how it functions? What can you do here that was never possible before the internet? Music, you name it. And the common theme across all of our investments is that we specialize in platforms, web and mobile platforms, and we call them networks. And the idea is software-based platforms that can enable new forms of connection, commerce, transactions. And when we think about the topic of this conference, which is the transformation of the digital global economy, we think about it in terms of a pretty epic shift that across all sectors, across all of society, which is the shift from a hierarchical industrial model of organizing